Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. One subject is always tricky, namely, why we all blunder. Well, that's a tough question. We're all humans, I guess that's why. If we'd be computers, we wouldn't fall into silly traps of blundering our queen or getting checkmated in one or two moves that normally we see, but once in a while we forget about. In this lesson, I'll show you some examples from games that were played among good players, international masters or grandmasters or masters, to show you that even they make mistakes, perhaps less frequently than you may. However, the point is to learn from them and to be always kind of suspicious. Because don't forget, when you play, you try to win, you do your best, but remember, your opponent is there to trick you, which means that ultimately you have different opposing goals. You're trying to win, and your opponent is trying to do the same, but that's not the same result, right? Okay, so let's get started and see how this works out in practice. We'll see games between masters and international masters and even grandmasters, and you'll see that they make mistakes when they have a bad moment. Here we go. In this position, it was Black's turn. Let's look at the position for a moment and evaluate what's going on. At this moment, White has an extra pawn and all other pieces are equal. What should Black do? Well, Black's hope is to create an attack against the White king. The White king doesn't have the normal f2 g2 defensive pawn structure in front of the king. The king is on g2 and there is no f pawn, and the g and h pawns have been also already advanced. Moreover, Black has at the moment full control of the open f file by doubled rooks on f7 and f6. As we know, the queen is the strongest piece to attack with. However, moving the queen right away, which Black did, may not necessarily mean that it's a good move. And that was Black's move, queen to g4, with obvious ideas of then playing queen to f3 check and develop a strong attack against the White king. The problem with this move is that it allows a brilliant combination on White's side. And this is what I mean, that one needs to be always suspicious when it comes to tactics. Every move in chess that moves from one square to another releases the control of certain squares, while obviously targets others. In this case, the Black queen has moved from e6 to g4 and therefore no longer protects the rook on f6. This, on turn, allows White a brilliant combination by playing queen f6, sacrificing the queen for just the rook, with the idea of the beautiful double rook checkmate, coming down with the rook from the c-file, and when the king moves up, then checkmate in the corner arrives. Well, this is all nice and beautiful. However, this is not how the game ended. Let's go back again and see what happened after queen g4, which was a big mistake because it left the rook on f6 unprotected. The queen captured it, and Black had in mind to play queen e4 check. That's what he played. And this was a critical moment of the game when something unexplainable happened. And it's easy to think that, oh well, this didn't change the actual substance of the position. I just moved my king out of the check wherever. And then if rook takes the queen, I checkmate the same way with rook c7 followed by rook h8. I have to tell you, it's very rare in chess when you can make a move whatever, that it doesn't matter what move you make. Most of the time in chess, it very much matters whether you move to one square or to a neighboring one. Let's look for a moment what happens if right now the white king moves to f1. That would be a major blunder because all of a sudden the black rook could capture the queen with a check. And therefore white would not have the time to play rook to c7 followed by checkmate. White in the actual game blundered by moving the king to h2, forgetting that the black queen now can capture the rook with a check again. As you can see, you especially need to watch out for moves that are checks. And now the white queen doesn't have time to checkmate in the corner or capture the rook on f7. The white king needs to move out of the check, and then the queen is lost. So, after queen g4 and queen takes rook, queen e4, moving the king to h3 would also be a mistake, because in that case, black would check in the corner on h1, and after rook h2, give up the queen for a rook, and then capture the queen with an equal rook endgame. And finally, let's see what would have been the correct move after queen takes rook and queen takes pawn, and now the only correct move that keeps white's advantage is to move to g1. Now, neither the queen on f6 nor the rook on c2 can be captured with a check, and if it's not a check, then white checkmates. And after the other check, queen e1, the white king now can safely move to h2, and now black has no more reasonable checks, and therefore the game is lost. White threatens to checkmate with queen h8 or capturing the rook. And if rook takes queen, then the already mentioned rook c7 followed by rook h8 decides the game. Well, a painful loss for white, who was one of the American grandmasters. Let's move on to our next example, which was played in a TV match live on television in England between two international masters long time ago in 1976. In this position that we see, black has sacrificed a pawn earlier, and therefore now white is a pawn ahead. However, white has to be careful. The pawn on e2 is under attack, and white could and should protect it with the rook. Instead, white was careless and moved the knight to e5 with the idea to block up the e-file and protect the pawn on e2 that way, thinking that at the same time now the knight also attacks the pawn on f7, which is all very true, but results in trouble. And the trouble is that the knight on e5 is protected by white's bishop on f4. However, that bishop may be deflected from the defense of the knight. And this is a tricky situation where I suggest you try to take your time and figure out yourself what black should do to win material. Then come back and listen to the solution. The solution is bishop captures d2. Now, if the white bishop captures back, obviously the knight is hanging on e5 and black will be clearly ahead. Therefore, white pretty much has no choice but to capture back with the rook. What should black do now? Continue with the same idea. exchange rooks on d2. If bishop captures back, white would face the same trouble, losing the knight on e5. Therefore, white better off captures back with the king. And what to do now? No more exchanges that would pull the bishop's hand back to d2. However, now black is ready to combine the idea of pulling the hand of the bishop with another tactical idea. And the correct move now is to play g5. A very smart move, and because the white king is on d2 now, it means that after bishop g5, which seemingly would be okay, because if now rook takes knight, then the bishop would capture also the black knight, but the black knight would give a fork with knight e4 and then capture the bishop. After g5, the game continued with knight takes f7, hoping that if pawn takes bishop now, then knight forks on d6. But here the problem is that black can again make an intermediate move. And that's one of the most commonly overlooked moves, a move that is an in-between move before a natural capture or a natural move that one gives a check, right here. Knight e4, and when the king moves, then pawn takes and black is ahead. For example, if pawn takes, then a skewer with rook f8, knight g5, and rook f4. Even though white has 2 pawns against black's extra bishop, but that's a winning advantage for black in an endgame like this, because white cannot get a 3rd pawn on h7, because then the knight immediately would be trapped after rook f7. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Well, this is a position with a lot of pieces, and typically you need a bit more time to figure out that what is going on the board when you see almost all the pieces still participating. It looks like a rather closed position without much tactics happening. One hint that I can give you is that in any position, whether there are few pieces left on the board, but even more so in positions with a lot of pieces still participating, be aware which pieces of yours as well as of your opponents are on unprotected squares. And they may be even pawns. Like in this case, you can see that the white pawns on d5 and d3 are both on unprotected squares. And all the other pieces are protected by at least one of the other pieces from the same army. The question is, why is it important that those pawns are on unprotected squares when they are not being attacked? Well, you'll see very quickly why. In this position, when white has many reasonable moves and the position is approximately equal, white made a careless move, bishop to e1, seemingly not making any difference to the position, or any significant difference to the position. But the problem is that white does not have the time to move the king out of the pin by moving the king to g1, because then the black bishop will simply capture on d3. On the other hand, if white tries to protect the pawn by playing queen c2, for example, that would make things not any better, because black can use the pin immediately by playing e4, attacking white's knight. The pawn, of course, is taboo on e4 because of the pin, and then black will follow up with bishop takes pawn. So as you can see, even in a closed position where trouble seems to be not on the horizon, when you have pieces on unprotected squares, trouble can appear at any time. So always be on the lookout for different tactical motives, especially the most common ones, such as the fork or the pin or the discovery. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, it was white's move. Obviously, black gave a check with queen on g1, and white has only one legal move, which was king to g3. As usual, we need to ask ourselves the question, what does our opponent want to do? And the first thing is always to look around if there is a checkmate threat or a threat to capture one of our pieces. And in this case, the answer to that would be quite easy. White is threatening to move the rook up to e8 and checkmate. So, what should we think to do here? First, look around, see if you can progress with your own attack against the white king. In this case, the result of that search will be that while we can try, but there is no good way to continue the attack at the moment for black. Black needs to attend to white's threat of the checkmate with rook e8. And the correct move here was to play rook d8, simply protect the back rank, avoid a checkmate. Now black is a pawn ahead, and white's king ultimately is in a more delicate position than black's is. However, black, after king g3, made a different move by playing rook d4, which is also a logical move, preventing the checkmate, because if now rook e8, the king can freely move out to g7. And in fact, it proposes the exchange of rooks, and generally speaking, when you're ahead in material, which black here is, being a pawn up, exchanging pieces is helpful. Also, at the same time, black has set up a trap that if now white would capture the pawn on c5, pinning the black rook, then the rook could move out of the pin with a discovered check and in fact win the white queen. Let's go back to the position after rook d4, where actually white has a winning move. As I always suggest, first look out for checkmates or checks or captures, or at times attacking an important major piece. Here there is an idea for white trying to trap the queen with rook e1. Looks like it's game over. Well, not so easy. Black has counted on that and planned a counter trap by playing rook d3 check, and if queen takes, black maintains the extra pawn in the queen endgame, giving him decent winning chances. Let's go back again to the beginning. Came king g3, rook d4, and we saw that after rook e1, black escapes, in fact maintaining the advantage. So how can white still win this game? Well, the brilliant ending to the game was white making an intermediate move by giving a check, forcing the enemy king into the pin. And that's the major difference, that when now the white rook retreats to e1, trapping black's queen, all of a sudden the black rook on d4 cannot move to d3 because it's pinned, and therefore white is winning. A very nice example. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, it was white's turn, and white moved the rook up to c7, attacking black's bishop. This position is clearly superior for black. Black can win by many ways. Black is up 2 pawns, so black needed simply simplify, capture the knight, and then exchange queens. As the general advice is, when you're ahead material, simplify, get to an endgame, and then your material advantage will be even more meaningful. But in the game, after rook c7, black thought it doesn't matter. And as I mentioned, usually, in fact, it does matter what you play. Black wanted to keep the bishop still on the board and perhaps win the knight, because if now the white knight moves away, then indeed black wins even faster by pinning the white queen. What black forgot about was the check that comes with the queen and what follows after that. Black is lost in this position because after king h8, couple more checks follow, and after rook c7, black is hopeless, followed by queen c8 on the next move. Let's go back. After rook c7, bishop b5, check, and king h7. If the king goes to h7 right away, it's not any better because again the queen captures, and then rook c8 and white wins. So the moral of the story is never think it doesn't matter. Almost always in chess there is a best move and the rest are inferior. Let's move on to our next example. Here we are. In this position, black is ready to give perpetual checks at any time, and in fact, after king e1 right now, black repeated moves by check and check on e4 and king f1, and could have played on, having an extra pawn, by playing rook df8 with a very nice position and excellent winning chances. Instead, black made a mistake, found a tactic that seemingly works, namely traded rooks, checked with the queen, and came up with the tactic of the skewer, rook f2, followed by check and king f1, queen b2. What he forgot about was that now white simply advances the pawn to a7, and black cannot stop the pawn long term because after queen b7, check followed by pawn promotion gives white the winning advantage. So always be careful and calculate the variation a bit further than you would. Always look if at the end of the variation, or at the moment that you think is the end of the variation, does your opponent have another check or another capture, or in this case, a far advanced pass pawn that's about to get promoted. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. As usual, I suggest you take your time and figure out yourself what the solution is. This is a relatively easy one, so hopefully it will not take you a long time to do so. And the answer is white to win by playing g4. If king captures pawn, the queen is lost. On the other hand, if the queen captures, then white has an elegant skewer with queen d7, and the black queen becomes history again. Thank you so much for listening, and so long until next week. Bye-bye.